Today's News Talk Radio.
I do a lot of streaming radio.
I do a lot of free streaming.
TNTRadio.live.
And welcome back to the Patrick Henningsen Show with me, Basil Valentine, in for Patrick. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by one of our regular guests on a Monday, the very well-informed and particularly erudite Sam Husseini. Welcome to the program, Sam.
Delighted to be with you, Basil. Thank you.
Lots of noise on social media, quite understandably, most of it extremely sympathetic to Aaron Bushnell and liking him to the Buddhist monk who self-immolated in 1963 in protest of the Vietnam War, only, of course, for that war to continue for another 10 or 11 years. One of the most poignant comments I came across on the X platform today is as follows. They'll brand Aaron Bushnell's martyrdom as an act of someone who is mentally ill, but the sadistic carpet bombing of tens of thousands is completely rational and not cause for extreme counter-demonstration. Bushnell represented an errant grain of conscience in a murder machine. And sadly, I fear that much of certainly the response from Tel Aviv, the Mossad commentary account posted a picture of Aaron on fire with the words, "Our enemies kill themselves." And I've noticed that the corporate media are doing their best to avoid going there. And when they have gone there, they've simply referred to the fact that he set himself on fire, not the fact that his last words were "Free Palestine." And he made a detailed statement saying he could no longer be complicit with the genocide.
Yeah, it's an incredibly moving act, and I followed self-immolations for some time. You mentioned the Buddhist self-immolations in Vietnam, actually protesting the oppression by the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese government of Buddhists, and that was sort of that informed U.S. protesters, some of whom immolated themselves during the Vietnam War, and also several people immolated themselves around the Iraq War, and they were largely ignored. So it's really remarkable, that one of the cliches about media is, if it bleeds, it leads. They want sensationalism and so on and so forth. But they have repeatedly ignored people who, for reasons of conscience, have self-immolated themselves. This case became more difficult because he live streamed it, and it got on big tech platforms, and lots of people saw it, even though part of it was blurred out. I actually posted on my Substack the full video, not blurred out, and even the blurring out, it seemed to me, was highly problematic. He made it quite clear in his short statement that he was disgusted with what was going on in Palestine, the portrayals of Palestinians, and the sanitization of what's being done to the Palestinians. And yet his own death, which he took pains to live stream, was itself sanitized by being blurred and so on. I actually got my Twitter account suspended by making the comparison between the graphic photograph, the iconic photograph of the Buddhist monk immolating himself, and the blurred out image that went around Twitter and such with Bushnell. My account got reinstated in a couple hours after I protested. But the core thing is, that there's a silencing effect going on. People don't feel heard. And that's why I think you have people resorting to what seem like desperate measures. Also, people talk about this as a suicide. And, if you talk to if you listen to Buddhist monks and others, they will say this isn't a suicide. This has its roots in a an attempt at literal enlightenment, and dying not as a sense of personal desperation, but rather as a path to helping others, an altogether different psychological manifestation, even though they both result in death.
Yes, and I don't want Aaron's death to pass without quoting the man himself. As you say,
Absolutely.
corporate media is doing its best to ignore him. There's no reference to his death on the front page of The Guardian that I can find, supposedly the world's leading liberal voice. He said before the incident, "I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest. But compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of the colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal." And, Aaron has very eloquently there pointed up the fact that one person burning themselves to death in front of the White House the Israeli embassy, sorry, is no more horrific. In fact, it's a microcosm of what's happening in Gaza, where people are being burned alive, suffocating to death under collapsed buildings, having operations and amputations without anesthesia, and starving to death, as well, of course, as having their loved ones die in front of them. And a combination of propaganda by omission, that although we see these things on social media, hundreds of Palestinians can die in a night, and it registers barely a ripple on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, BBC, or any of those outlets. And the sheer horror of the suffering is entirely screened from what we now call low information populations in the West. So what Aaron was trying to do, I mean, what he succeeded in doing, was in pointing to the extreme human suffering that's going on, and yet that we're supposed to sort of accept as, well, the key phrase now, Sam, is it's war, and terrible things happen in war. That's what we're being told, isn't it?
We are being told that, and the State Department has been filled with tisk, 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 and we mourn every life and this complete disingenuousness, and we're wanting the Israelis to take precautions and so on. It's not war, it's genocide. They are targeting civilian infrastructure facilities. They are starving a population. They are saying they are starving a population. And it's that very kind of mass deceit and mass propaganda that I'm certain propelled Aaron Bushnell to take the measures that he did, because the U.S. public even is rendered moot. A majority have wanted a ceasefire for some time, every demographic group, if you look at it, and it's not reflected a whit in the power structure of the United States. And it's also U.S. military people are, they have very limited free speech rights. They're grunts. It's these chicken hawk types that go and send them off to war to kill and die. And they're supposed to just shut up and do their jobs. And I'm sure that festers a great deal of resentment in the ranks of military people, many of whom presumably signed up to actually defend the United States. But that's not what's happening. I should say, to my point earlier, that the self-immolations have been ignored. A woman immolated herself in December in front of the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. I can't even find her name. I can't even find out if she died because she didn't live stream it. Bushnell had the presence of mind to not only do this so that we know his name, he ensured that we know his name because he live streamed it. And got it to some media that at least got it out in blurred form, and eventually the full video came out. So that unfortunately, and again, in contrast, you mentioned the Buddhist monk. That iconic picture of that Buddhist monk immolating himself, that was by an AP photographer, and it won the Picture of the Year award by the relevant association. And it was for that image that my Twitter account was suspended today for several hours, so that an image of graphic reality, the gruesome reality of someone immolating themselves, was heralded as a great iconic image in 1963, but now in 2024, it'll get you suspended from Twitter, X, whatever.
Yes. Caitlin Johnston, the Australian commentator, said that she'd watched the whole thing. It's extremely harrowing. I haven't shared it, and I certainly wouldn't play it on this platform because I think it's up to each individual to decide whether they want to see it. She said that the sounds that were made are as affecting as the images, the sound of the petrol can, the accelerant that he used, and the shouts from a police officer who was pointing a firearm at him to get down on the floor when the man was clearly, fully aflame, and a bystander shouting, "It's not guns we need, it's fire extinguishers." Caitlin said this was sort of the epitome of modern America, really, in a single act.
Probably, but it's quite possible that officer pointing that gun could have been Israeli. We don't know. So it could have been a joint operation, as much is between the United States and Israel. I would love it if somebody dug into that and figured out the individuals involved in responding to him. That is incredibly harrowing. The fact that there are people, he's literally burning himself alive. And these people are screaming at him, to get on the ground, as if he's threatening anyone. And many media reports put out that that no one in the embassy was hurt, and they did the same thing. It was even worse in December when the woman immolated herself in Atlanta. You had media reports with a straight face quoting Israeli officials, calling it a hate crime. It's an act of anti-Semitism for this woman, who we don't even know her name or if she's alive, that she immolated herself, and the Israeli officials are pretending that she's full of hate. That's the degeneration of discussion on this matter. A lot of people said that the audio was harrowing, and it was. I totally agree with that. But some people, I doubt Caitlin, said it in a way to justify not showing the video, which I would seriously question. I made an extensive note before I present the video on my Substack to say this is extremely graphic, and it shows a man immolating himself after he explains why he's going to do it. But again, I go back to, as far as I know, that AP photo of the Buddhist monk immolating himself was in tons of newspapers in the United States. And
yes,
it
absolutely.
moved people.
Yes,
but no newspaper, I can say with strong confidence, no newspaper is going to put on its front page, or probably anywhere else, an image of Aaron Bushnell being burned. And Twitter will likely ban you if you post that. I don't. I mean, I posted a juxtaposition of his face as he was talking, and an image of his immolation. I don't know what the consequences of that would be, but that seemed to me to be a fair representation of what happened. So I think that there is this queasiness about showing reality, and people pay to see Hollywood movies full of gore, but it's all fictionalized. We look for fictionalized gore, but we avoid the actual horrors that policy manifests. And I think that there's something deeply disturbing about that.
Absolutely. And of course, there's also the hierarchy of causes. In other words, Aaron killed himself to draw attention to the plight of the Palestinians. And it's highly dubious whether the corporate media regards that as a worthy cause to die for, which is why it wasn't referred to by the headlines in the New York Times, CNN Politics, Washington Post. Active duty airman sets himself on fire outside DC's Israeli embassy, as if it's as normal a thing to do as delivering milk. No reference to Gaza, no reference to his last words. The New York Times, a man set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, the police said. I mean, this is...
Yeah, for people, for people who haven't, seen the audio or video, it should be emphasized. His last words were "Free Palestine" over and over again. He was screaming it in what may well have been his dying breaths, over and over again as he stood there, aflame in front of the Israeli embassy. For that not to crack the headline as to what is actually going on here is ridiculous. There's even some reports that are like, the whole, mental stability thing and so on. Presumably because they can't seem to conceive of the notion of somebody sacrificing themselves for a greater cause that they don't see, that they fail to see the validity of.
Well, it's very interesting that he was a serving U.S. airman that chose to do this. If you'd asked me who would be a likely candidate to self-immolate in front of the Israeli embassy, I would say it would be some sort of either a Buddhist or some sort of extreme New Age peacenik type. Do you know what I mean? You wouldn't, or dare I say it, a conspiracy theorist, or you wouldn't expect it to be somebody who has signed up for the U.S. military and is only aged 25, and has therefore grown up in the USA, heavily propagandized onto the Israeli side, and yet Aaron had managed to see his way through that all the way to making the ultimate sacrifices, extremely unexpected.
I think different people get into the military for widely different causes. And some people get into the military because they're brave. Some because there are all kinds of terrible reasons for getting into the military. Presumably he got in because he was brave. And this is an incredibly brave, self-sacrificing act that, again, Buddhist monks emphasize. This is designed to wake us up. People, in a sense, we're all oxidizing slowly. We're all aging, and they choose to do it all at once. In an attempt to foster a better life for other people, and to wake people up to the reality. And military people in some frequently have a fairly good grasp of reality, because they got to look at the reality in order to do military activity. Some use it for very insidious means, but you do see a pattern of whistleblowers and others coming out of the military. So I'm not totally surprised by that.
There's a huge Wikipedia article up about the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell already, and it states quite clearly that US complicity in genocide and his part in that as a serving US airman was central to his motivation. During the incident, Wiki says, Bushnell said he was protesting what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, and declared that he will no longer be complicit in genocide, before dousing himself with the flammable liquid. So, it's the role of the US and his role in the US military that led him to take this ultimate step.
Yes, I mean, he explicitly says he won't be complicit on the videotape. I'm sort of pleasantly surprised that Wikipedia, from what you say, has a decent entry on him, because I'd noticed.
Likewise.
I noticed that I think they had no choice in this case. Again, he live streamed it. I'd noted in my article. I wrote an article in 2001, I guess. I'm losing track of the years, but I wrote an article about Gregory Levy, who self-immolated himself regarding the Iraq War in 1991, and was just ignored. And I was stunned at how much it was ignored. And then after I wrote that, I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Wilson. He is a former military person who was moved by Americans who immolated themselves about the Vietnam War. He eventually laid down on tracks to try to stop. He was a former military person as well. He laid down on tracks to try to stop munitions from going to Central America during the wars in the 1980s. And the train ran over his feet. And he lost his feet. And he's since retired in Nicaragua. He's a very dedicated activist. After I wrote that piece about one person who immolated themselves trying to stop the Iraq War, he told me there were two others that I didn't even know about. So again, there's a pattern of these people being ignored. They generally don't get Wikipedia entries even. They might, there might be there might be a small article in there somewhere around them. There was one immolator who I profile, a musician from Chicago, who immolated himself in 2006 about the Iraq War, and I couldn't even get Democracy Now! To mention it. There has been a real reluctance by a great mindset of people to ignore this. And I think it's because people don't want to face how horrible the policy is. And that, if these people are trying to wake us up, people sometimes don't want to be woken up. And I think that it is something that needs to be focused on.
And I'm sorry to say that there will be people who are pleased to see that Aaron has passed away. Yes. And of course, the key question is the genocide. Netanyahu has said he plans to attack Rafah regardless of any hostage deal. There's still supposedly, backroom moves involving Cairo and the Qataris to bring about a ceasefire, but we know that the Israelis are absolutely hell-bent, and I use the term advisedly, on destroying as much of Gaza as they possibly can. They're quite open about it. It seems they're quite happy to kill 100 or 1,000 Palestinian civilians, including children, if they manage to get one Hamas operative. Netanyahu is claiming they've destroyed the majority of the Hamas battalions. We've got no idea no way of verifying any claim like that. But it seems that the United States is determined to continue to provide the ammunition, to provide the diplomatic cover, and to provide the money for the slaughter to continue.
Yeah, I think that Hamas is the pretext, genocide is the means, and ethnic cleansing is the goal. You now have apparent Egyptian complicity building these facilities in the Sinai. I would, I mean, Blinken's been running around the Middle East for several months with multiple trips. He's clearly not running around trying to create peace. He's running around trying to make deals, to buy acquiescence, and to bribe and threaten Arab governments into going along with things. So it's quite likely from the information that we have that they've struck a deal of some sort with the Egyptians, that they will run some kind of facility that Israel is planning to drive out Palestinians again, who have already been driven out of their homes in what is now Israel. People say Palestinians have nowhere to go. That's not true. They have someplace that they should go. Palestinians in Gaza should go back to their homes in what is now Israel proper under international law. That is actually their right. But Israel has been trashing international law for decades. And the US and the Saudis will probably pay for it. I mean, not pay for it, but I mean, they will finance the, putting these Palestinians for some time in these facilities. In tent facilities in the Sinai, and they'll cover it up as it's humanitarian, so that not so many of them get killed. Israel is an expansionist settler colonial state, and this is what they do. They continuously drive out the indigenous population, and that's what Israel's been doing, and is continuing to do. I don't think that Hamas is the target at all. I think Hamas is the excuse. Hamas is the pretext. I honestly think deep in their hearts, Netanyahu and company were delighted. I don't know. People might take grave exception to that, but they wanted a pretext in order to go after the Palestinians in the way that they've done. They obviously had
without a doubt.
They obviously had a plan in place to do it. They did it repeatedly over the years, every several years. They call it mowing the lawn. They'd bomb the hell out of Gaza. They did it in 2009, 2014, 2021, and now at an even greater level. So part of what's needed is far more serious international action. You had South Africa go to the International Court of Justice. You had proceedings about the illegality of the occupation going on this last week, at the International Court of Justice. You have people just making rhetorical statements like Lula in Brazil saying, this is genocide and, it creates a hubbub and so on. There's a lot that Brazil could do beyond, making proclamations, beyond the Arab group at the General Assembly is obviously moving to suspend Israel from the General Assembly and possibly admit Palestine as a member. But they could also do things like try to set up a tribunal at the General Assembly to go after individuals, since the International Criminal Court has a corrupt prosecutor and isn't doing what it's supposed to do. And this British barrister, Khan, is clearly a con artist, and is not upholding the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. He's complicit. The prosecutor is in on the genocide. He, like the United States, is effectively greenlighting, giving diplomatic cover for Israel to conduct its genocide.
Yes, the diplomatic cover extends, of course, to the ICJ as well, because coincidentally, there's been the case all last week, the hearings about the occupation. Very simply, the occupation itself is against international law. And we had speakers from a number of different countries saying, look, quite simply, Israel has to withdraw to the 1967 borders and dismantle all the settlements. You can talk about peace processes and all the rest of it, but international law takes precedence over any of that. It'd be very interesting to see what the judges decide. And of course, the United States was, I believe, the only country that defended the occupation and said that Israel's security would be compromised if it was forced to end the occupation. Since when does one country's security take precedence over ending an occupation? I mean, it's really bizarre stuff, Do you think that process is going to get anywhere, Sam?
Well, I mean, I don't even buy the notion that it's for Israel's security. If Israel wanted security, it would have made peace a hell of a long time ago. It is engaging in murderous activities that endanger its own citizens because it's an expansionist power that obviously cares not a whit for Palestinian life, but is willing to sacrifice some measure of Jewish-Israeli life as well to perpetuate its expansionist project. I fear that there were some important statements, I think, that were made in the occupation hearing from the last week at the ICJ. But some is purely rhetorical, from Arab governments that are playing footsie with Israel. I mean, it's not to be taken seriously.
Yes.
But I fear that, Israel is fundamentally one step ahead. You want to declare the occupation illegal. Well, fine, we'll get rid of the occupation because we'll have an outright ethnic cleansing, and maybe we will annex the territory. The ICJ argument, part of it is that this has effectively been an annexation. Occupation, military occupation, isn't illegal typically per se, because the rules of it are envisioned to minimize the damage of it. So think of World War II, right? Germany occupied France. Okay, you can do that, but you have to abide by certain laws. The U.S. occupied Germany. You can do that, but you have to abide by, certain requisites. Israel isn't applying by those requisites and is effectively been annexing, and that's part of what the case is saying, that they're annexing it. Israel might well say, okay, fine, we're going to annex it, and we're going to drive out a bunch of Palestinians. I mean, when they drive out, as they plan to do, if they drive out, as they clearly plan to do, Palestinians from Gaza, you're going to have people doing massive protests on the West Bank. Israel will likely use that as a pretext to even more target Palestinians on the West Bank. So it's like a system that targets anyone who protests against its insidious criminality. Part of the root of all of this is Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal, right? So one could construct an argument that effectively everyone is in part intimidated by Israel for a number of reasons, but one reason being that the Iranians know that Israel can dust Tehran. Push comes to shove, the Russians know that Israel could, it would be suicidal, obviously, but they could dust Moscow. It's power politics at its worst. And other countries have to think far more creatively and strategic. I mean, you even had the Chinese at the ICJ hearings argue that Hamas is a national liberation movement. Now, international lawyers and activists have made that point for years. Francis Boyle, for example, like the FLN in Algeria and the ANC in South Africa, and so on. But for the Chinese to say it was interesting. And the logical consequence of that would be, okay, then you should actually be backing Hamas if you actually believe that. Other countries need to step up and assert themselves. Otherwise, there's nothing left of international law virtually.
Finally, Sam, people still talk about the two-state solution. Where exactly is the Palestinian state supposed to exist? Is the Security Council going to recommend one or even vote for one, as Josep Borrell suggested last week at the G20, or is it completely doomed?
Well, I don't know how realistic it is. It's a hanging on to international law, because that's what international law at this juncture still calls for: a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. To me, it's a secondary question at this point, whether it's one state or two state. What needs to happen is that the Israeli genocide needs to stop. Yeah.
Indeed it does, and the sooner the better, because the vast majority of people the world over have quite simply had enough of the carnage. And it wouldn't surprise me if there weren't more self-immolators in the weeks and months ahead if this continues. Sam Husseini from Washington, thank you so much for joining us today on today's News Talk.
Thank you, Basil.
There he goes then, Sam Husseini, and you can follow him on Substack and Twitter. We're going to take a break for the headlines. When we come back, Kit Clarenberg and the UK National Security State.